Hi, Adam. Thank you so much for coming on Scholars in Spotlight. This is going on for long that we are trying to maybe modify the name a little bit because this is the name which was just given, but let's see what happens. But thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I will do an intro, but I know that you research in conflict, race, power structures, and topics like unhoming or displacement. So all of these topics seems emotionally taxing, and especially what's happening these days, either it appears or it actually has increased or the awareness has increased around these topics. It must be even more harder to navigate now your daily research. So first of all, how do you in your personal life manage that kind of um, emotional exhaustion? Is there a practice? I mean, how, or you have developed something? I'd love to know about it.
I think that one of the ways that helps to maintain energy and excitement and I guess a positive approach to the work that I do, which can be very emotionally exhausting, is the fact that a lot of my research isn't necessarily about the problems of policing and racism, isn't simply about the problems of gentrification and the housing crisis in cities like London. It's about resistance. It's about people who are building alternatives, who are challenging the systems of injustices and inequalities that they and their communities are faced with. And I think taking an approach which begins with thinking about how people are empowering themselves and each other, how they're building alternative visions of the world that they want to live in, how they're connecting with each other across communities and across the world, I think is difficult to not be inspired by. It's difficult to not feel a sense of hopefulness in the world when you take that approach to your academic research. And I think for me, that's the one thing that really helps me to keep going with what can often be quite an emotionally taxing topic of
Yeah,
inquiry.
yeah. Thanks. I can a bit now can see that a lot of people who research in human rights, on different areas on corporate social responsibility, what corporations are doing, when they are talking about these issues, I realize that a lot of positivity comes out, that how people come together and then say that, okay, you know what, that's it. And we can do something. So yeah, there is a bit of an antidote to it. This is brilliant. So Human Geographer is something. It's very interesting. It seems like something which I want to know more about, like how this kind of word has evolved. So, is this something you think that is somehow closely defining or explaining what do you do?
So, human geography, for people who are unfamiliar, is, I guess, geography can be divided into two kind of broad areas. On the one hand, you have kind of physical geography, which might be the geography people are familiar with in school, where they learn about different geological rocks or formations in that regard, or things like the water cycle and the physical elements of the earth. But human geography is thinking about people and how people relate to space and place. And I think it becomes a really useful lens for understanding topics such as housing and policing, because it's about people's relationship to their home and their community on the one hand, or the ways in which the state seeks to control specific jurisdictions or polities on the other. And so looking at the ways in which different spaces and places become home, or the ways in which different spaces and places become controlled, or that control is resisted by people, enables us, I think, a really useful lens in, on the one hand, conceptualizing these processes of power and resistance, but also, I think, understanding the differences between how these forms of power emerge in different contexts across the country and the planet.
Brilliant. So I met you in 2019 for the first time. So it seems like, because of what the protests has been going on in the society, and how social media research has been coming out, that there are social bubbles, and then uh, there's a lot of protests against police in US. um, I mean, we can't ignore it, because US is something which somehow makes news all over the world. I actually am confused genuinely, that what it is now. Is it that the problems have actually increased in the last few years, or the awareness around the problems have increased, so that's why the noise, or the power structures themselves is somehow weakening, so there is a lot of resistance which somehow seeps through it? I mean, what is it? Or is it just the perception because of social media? We think that these issues are somehow increasing.
I think there are maybe three or four key reasons why, in the summer of 2020, we've seen some of the largest anti-racist protests in both American history and British history, and potentially even the world. I think one of them is, of course, the spark of these protests, right? So the police killing of George Floyd, which it was difficult to not to find traumatizing, harrowing, slow, or effectively being tortured to death in a very public way. I think the second is the fact that there is a wider concern, I think, with racism and nationalism across the world, particularly in places like Britain and the United States, being defined by the Trump administration in the US and Brexit and the Boris Johnson administration in the United Kingdom. And you saw this in a lot of the placards and the things that people were chanting and saying at the protests, which were as much about Boris Johnson and Donald Trump as they were about the questions of police violence and racism. But I think the third thing is the fact that both Britain and the United States and much of the world are facing some other crises at the moment, which I think have fermented popular discontent. The most obvious one, of course, being the health crisis, which a lot of people consider to be very seriously mismanaged by the governments of both Britain and the United States, with Black people being more likely to contract and die of COVID-19. And I think it is. I think the pandemic has illuminated a lot of existing inequalities for people, but also the other crises that are being faced: the looming environmental crisis, economic crisis. All of these different crises, I think, have all lend themselves to, I think, a perfect storm, which has led to the protests that we've seen in the summer of this year, which, as I said, was sparked by a police killing, but I think speak to wider concerns about racism, nationalism, and injustice across the world.
So I actually had some encounters with police and also home office, as you can imagine. I've born in Pakistan, so I've lived here, and it's interesting. I mean, you have to really understand that your encounter is with the machinery and system, not this one individual, because it would be really hard. I mean, if I can understand, I meet with people and they had a deep trauma around these interaction of forced searches. Somehow they come in and interview you in a very interesting way, let's say that. And but I can understand that they sometimes think after this kind of interaction that like the humanity itself, they doubt humanity, their own humanity itself. But when I had it, I can see it because of maybe, I don't know, maybe I've studied it a little bit, the sociology, so I could see that this is very interesting, that the person I'm interacting with really believes that what they are doing is somehow perfectly fine, that they have to eliminate this person because of very specific background, and there's a quota system. I don't know if it is true or not, but is there like a difference between these kind of systems, like British police and US police, their US immigration and UK's immigration? Are there any differences? And if there are, how do we sitting here, distinguish between these two? Or is there a point distinguishing between these two? Because do we somehow engage in a different way if we are trying to understand and reform it? I mean, that's one of the reasons why I just wanted to ask this difference.
So, of course, there are a number of material differences between immigration, maybe counter-terror, or other kinds of anti-crime policies and practices between the United Kingdom and the United States. I mean, one obvious example is that in the United States, entrapment is very common, whereas entrapment is illegal in the United Kingdom. So, in the United States, a CIA agent can go to a mosque and convince someone uh, help them put together a bomb, and then as soon as they agree to do that, they can arrest them immediately and say, "Ha, I was a police officer all along." Or a police officer can stand on a street corner offering people drugs, and if someone goes up to buy those drugs, they can say, "Ha, I was a police officer all along," and arrest you. That's actually illegal in the United Kingdom, right? So that's maybe one really kind of simple example of the differences in policing in the United States and the United Kingdom. But the patterns of policing are very, very similar. The logic of policing is very, very similar. So the idea that there are suspect communities in both Britain and the United States overlaps enormously. Right? So the idea that there are black communities which should be considered suspect communities and therefore should be policed differently, should be policed as if they have a certain propensity for violence, a certain propensity for immorality and deviance. Pervades both British and American policing. Comparable things could be said of Muslim communities or perceived Muslims. Similar things could be said about migrant communities or people who maybe be suspected of being undocumented. And so we can see very similar patterns in both the US and the UK, but they might be manifested differently, right? So in the United States, for instance, you have a very, very large black Muslim population, whereas in the United Kingdom, most of our Muslim population is of South Asian heritage. Right, so you have comparable forms of the policing of Muslim communities, but that America are kind of targeting potentially different racialized groups of people. Or, for instance, most of the suspected undocumented people in the United States are people from Latin America, whereas that's not the case in the United Kingdom. And a lot of people in the United Kingdom who are suspected of being undocumented are from Africa or Asia or the Middle East. So again, you've got very similar types of policing, searching for people who are undocumented, potentially interrogating them, raiding their places of work, raiding their homes, incarcerating them in detention centres, attempting to deport them, all of these types of things. But you might have different communities of people who are the targets of this particular type of policing. And so I think it is useful to, identify the distinctions, particularly for researchers who want to make sure that their research is accurate, but also I think for communities and campaigners who want to be challenging the kinds of forms of discrimination or inequality or injustice that arise through these patterns of policing. But I think it's also fundamental for us to not treat the UK and the United States as fundamentally different. And identifying the connections and patterns, I think, is incumbent upon us, particularly given the global nature of these campaigns of resistance that we've seen in the summer of 2020.
That's true. I mean, I think sometimes my experience could have been maybe down to individual. They are maybe empathetic. They have trained better. Sometimes that's what I've realized, that if someone, mostly home office, they probably are not trained as well as police constable. So I could see that going through the motions, the appearance of interacting with the suspect, what is suspect for them, is better if someone is highly trained. Although to really, and this is what I'm asking you right now. I mean, this is what I came out after having this kind of interaction, that it is understandable to see the history of UK or US, or let's talk about UK. This is my interaction, that this is a system which is designed to, somehow filter some things. And at some point, I don't know, I mean, you don't want to let, of course, there's this concept that, okay, you don't want to let someone in which is really dangerous, but that is a very murky concept because, you can just brand anyone dangerous, as you are saying, according to however they look like or where the passport is from. So yeah, fundamentally, okay, that's fine. You got to keep the people safe. But how the system has been designed, you have, like, I think I saw it, that what it is designed for, like home office, really, even the name home office, it makes sense that they would see someone from a country and they would treat them like that. As in, it was not like a, it is a shocking behavior at first for me, but reflecting upon it, it does make more functional sense, not sense in a way that, oh yeah, this is morally okay. I'm just saying that it definitely seems like what it should be doing. Like, is it's doing its job right by traumatizing and intimidating people and making the entry as hard as possible. I mean, is that something which makes sense? How you have researched around these things?
I think it makes sense in the logic of the British states. I think the world would be a very peculiar place if every country in the world treated people who arrived in their country in the way that Britain treats the people who arrive in their country. I think the world would be a bizarre place. There has never been so much control over the movements of people today as there has ever been in human history. We have more borders, more policing of our borders, more control over movements than there has ever been. And I don't know if that's necessarily led to an increase in public safety. I don't know if that's necessarily led to an improvement in the lives of people. I think that, therefore, when we think about why Britain is so intent on controlling people entering its borders, it may be useful for us to think about what Britain's foreign policy is. It might be useful to think about the ways in which Britain is implicated in forms of perhaps political disorder or political injustices in different parts of the world which compel people to move, forms of economic underdevelopment and exploitation which compel people to migrate to countries like Britain, which are far wealthier, where much of the resources and wealth of the world continue to flow in ways that are comparable to the flows of wealth during the colonial period. It might be useful for us to ask ourselves why it is that large numbers of people from countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya seek to migrate to parts of Europe following the either invasions, occupations or bombings of these particular regions of the world. And so when we think about borders in this more global context, I think we should be unsurprised that the regions of the world which benefit from the exploitation of land, of resources, of people in so many parts of the world, seek to also regulate the movement of those people into their borders, even if there's very little or a very different kind of regulation of the land, of the resources and wealth from those parts of the world entering the borders of Britain.
Yeah, I think this is a very deep personal point. I think for me, growing up in Pakistan, let's say, and people over there still feel emotionally in their lives some sort of an impact, and they talk about it all the time. Even the generations, my generation, which is the third generation, so my grandfather, uh, well, this is what you say, they fought against the East India Company, and so yeah, he would tell stories, so I would remember them really fresh. So now we growing up one generation removed, still I think that there's an expression over there, they say the reason why we come to Britain is because you stole everything. Like literally they say this, and it's a very common sentence. And I actually, when you were talking about, I did realize that this is a very interesting connection, that how even now, I mean, what are the effects of colonialism now? Because everyone would now see that, oh yeah, colonialism is gone. But I guess if you see in Africa, in South Asian countries, where the effects of colonialism are still somehow indirectly seeping in, this movement does seems really interesting. Also, companies. There's this documentary which you might have seen, Virunga, which is about, it's a very interesting documentary in Africa. This is a park where they're trying to save this wildlife species and conserve nature, but there is one British company which is trying to um, yeah, just somehow gain influence, bribing army and the government officials to try to gain more influences. So and yeah, so they can't do anything much about it, and it's a brilliant documentary. I would suggest the listeners, if they haven't seen it, it would be really interesting. It would actually tell a little bit more somehow what could be the effects of colonialism. But I think I would like to know more, because these are the kind of things, these kind of connections, which we don't make anymore, because it's been nearly 100 years, 70 years, 1947 or 45, whatever, after the World War. Then when was the last time the empire fell?
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah, for parts of South Asia, it was 1945, but for parts of the African continents, we begin to see decolonization in 1958 up until the late 1960s. For parts of the Caribbean, it was the 1970s. I mean, my mother grew up under British colonial rule. St. Lucia didn't get its independence until the late 1970s. So it was, of course, uneven. But yeah, between 1945 and the 1970s was, I guess, the period of decolonization. So we're really only a generation away from colonialism, right? Most of our parents grew up either as colonial subjects or as in the center of empire, as an imperial nation. And so to think that the global world order, which was constructed through colonialism, and this is important to note, right, that um, colonialism didn't simply just take away the sovereignty of different lands and peoples and exploit those peoples and exploit their resources. It created a global world order, right, which placed European nations and its settler colonies in Australia and North America at the top of this global world order. And and this global world order didn't crumble when the formal colonial structures were dismantled. Right? That global world order remains, and we should be unsurprised that 2-3 centuries of power, of wealth, of control weren't immediately undone when the formal systems of colonialism were broken. And so, of course, therefore, Britain and other former colonial powers and countries and Europe's settler colonies in North America and Australia still hold enormous wealth and power, both whether it be military power or economic power or cultural diplomatic power, all of these forms of power which they were able to accumulate during centuries of colonialism are now continually being used to maintain that global order. And of course, whilst I would say that the West is in decline, in slow decline, and other regions of the world, particularly China, are on the rise. We still, of course, see those colonial legacies maintaining a global order, which places Europe and its settler colonies in the most powerful positions.
I actually, just about this paper you wrote about your trip to South Africa. I actually want to know. This was a very interesting trip. You described some things very emotionally and graphically, and this is a bit related to the movement about Rhodes Must Fall, which was the statue in Oxford. I actually want to know. You were describing symbols and colonial symbols somehow uh, parallel to what this new generation over there in Africa, university students, were trying to convey. I actually want to hear from you that experience.
So, for people who are unfamiliar, which I'm sure most people are familiar, Rhodes Must Fall was a campaign that began in the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Um, One of the things, I guess, for a bit of context, after the fall of apartheid in South Africa, one of the agreements was that black people would get political freedom, but there wouldn't be economic reform. White people still own the land in South Africa and can own and control much of the economy. And so, while there was a great deal of political reform in South Africa, which enabled black people to have the vote and other kind of civil freedoms and rights, and the ANC government in South Africa was able to invest a great deal of resources into education, Most black people still live in the same townships that their parents and grandparents grew up in under apartheid, in very similar conditions. And so universities like the University of Cape Town, set up during the apartheid era, or the colonial era, I should say, which were only for white people, are now full of black students, right? Learning in these very well-resourced historic universities that look and feel in very similar ways to a university like Oxford, Cambridge, or UCL or Durham. But there are many students who study at these universities who live and grew up and still live in townships who um, haven't really felt the material benefits of the end of apartheid rule. Don't have positive job prospects because of the fact that there wasn't really an economic revolution, only a political revolution in South Africa after the end of apartheid. And I think that, and one of the architects or one of the main ideologues of apartheid in Southern Africa was Cecil Rhodes, and his statue sits in the centre of the campus of the University of Cape Town. And so while students were campaigning to have that statue removed, saying that Rhodes must fall, it wasn't about simply a statue which offended them or was a symbol of a racist or a mean person that oppressed their ancestors. And it was the way in, it was a conduit, it was a way into a wider conversation about injustices in both in the university and beyond it. Not only the fact that the university was still run by managers, administrators, and academics from the apartheid era, and teaching very similar courses and syllabi, but also the fact that the economic situation in South Africa hasn't changed significantly since the end of apartheid either. And so the Rhodes Must Fall campaign was simultaneously a campaign for freedom and autonomy for students, but also about freedom and autonomy for the black population of the country. Here in the United Kingdom, Oxford University also has a statue of Cecil Rhodes, due to the great riches that he accumulated from the colonisation of Southern Africa being used to fund educational scholarships and buildings in institutions like Oxford. And so a solidarity campaign arose in Oxford University while I was carrying out my PhD there, which also called for this statue to be removed and looked at the ways in which Oxford University today is implicated in forms of modern imperialism, whether it be the fact that Shell Oil fund its geosciences centre, which has been implicated in forms of imperialism in parts of Nigeria, for instance, or the fact that BP Oil fund its Centre for the Study of Resource-Rich Economies, which has been implicated in forms of imperialism in parts of the Middle East, or whether arms companies or other weapons manufacturers fund its engineering departments, which are implicated in forms of militarism in other parts of the world. So it was a solidarity movement in that regard. And so I was fortunate enough to visit South Africa as part of this kind of campaign work that we were doing, and visit the University of Rhodes, named after Cecil Rhodes, visit University of Cape Town, visit Wits University in Johannesburg as well, and work with learn with the students in South Africa about the struggles that they were engaged in, both within the confines of the campus and beyond them as well. And the paper that you're describing, I guess, comes out of those experiences of learning from these activist students and the academics that were supporting them, as well as, I guess, my wider experiences visiting South Africa and building those links of solidarity between the struggles here in Britain and those abroad.
Beautiful. Yeah. I mean, I truly hope from the bottom of my heart that at so many different levels, we have these very painful conflicts from long history. I mean, I've grown up in Pakistan. I've visited Iran, Iraq. I mean, Middle East is still like the hub of crisis between different sects, different kind of races, religious ideologies, and then we and then the civilization start to form over the history, and then we have another layer of conflicts fueled by power. I really hope like that we can somehow, with not really destroying each other, can solve these issues, and evolve. Really, I mean, I think at this point it looks like that what as humans, what we are not anymore those humans who lived in those hunting gathering tribes. Not It just doesn't feel like they really were a very different creature. I mean, as much as I've read about them, and not in a good way or a bad way, it's just different, completely different way of lifestyle, relating to others, and how many of them have egalitarian societies, and probably it's because of the size they had and the number of population and what was limiting them, and this marriage of science and imperialism is just put. Imperialism, science, and capitalism gave an insane engine to certain qualities of humans. And, we are made out of these feedback loops. So I guess we definitely are very different from those humans which might have lived 30,000 years ago, 35,000 years ago. So I think, yeah, we thank you for like doing this work, because I think we have to evolve somehow, whatever we are, to see the similarities. I mean, otherwise the species is in pain. Like, overall our species is in so much pain and struggle and conflict that these kind of issues would either be solved by we evolving, or we would definitely go down, and that's it. I mean, it's what you're saying, it looks like that it's not just that emotionally we are damaging each other, we are damaging our habitat because of that power, and because of the wealth and greed, I would say, that bottomless hole which sometimes humans find because of the subjective urges, that that kind of an accumulation is harming um, the earth itself. I mean, it's to simply say that. But you talked about your mother, and then that she grew up like first-hand experience under the empire, let's say, or a falling empire. I mean, how? So, what is your story? I mean, how did you? Were you born here in UK, or I mean, what are this? What kind of ecosystem were you growing up in? And then, as you were growing up, how did you map the world growing up? I mean, if you are comfortable, love to know your personal experience around it.
Yeah, sure. No, so I grew up in Redbridge, which is a London borough in the east of London. So it borders East London and Essex. So it has Newham and Waltham Forest on the London side, and then Barking and Dagenham on the Essex side. And growing up in that area, I guess I was able to. Well, I guess growing up in a home where my mum grew up in Hackney and was affected by, I guess, the kind of anti-racist movements that exist in areas like Hackney in the 1970s and 80s. And she passed on, I guess, those experiences and that kind of politics to me, and that was very influential for my thinking. But also, I guess, growing up in the border of East London and Essex meant that experiences of injustice or racism were not things that were uncommon um, for growing up in that particular area. But I guess I really kind of began getting interested in politics and activism when I got to university. I mean, I was interested in politics already. I went to study politics for my undergraduate degree. But I think I became particularly interested in campaigning work when I began experiencing racism at university as well. I thought the university would be this enlightened place where everyone would be well-read and worldly and open-minded and all those types of things, and that certainly wasn't the case at all. And I think it also really came to a head when I started doing youth work as well whilst at university, and working with people, young people, and to run kind of social action projects or educational initiatives, um, to think through the kinds of problems that they were facing in their community, and think about the connections between what I was learning at university, what people were experiencing in their everyday lives in their different communities, and how I could build connections between, I guess, the theory and the practice.
So, were you looking when you were growing up as a teenager and then in a university, um, to UK, I assume, and then maybe the world or whatever stories your mother have told you about her life, um, as like a migrations, because everyone has like their lens when they start looking at the world. Like I have my lens. I grew up similar as you were describing, going to this very upper class school, but living in a very um, traditional tribe community, and that kind of diversification gave a lot of spark in my ideas, because I go in the morning there where there are Canadians, a lot of Canadians in my school, and Americans, and then I go back to my very tribal, traditional, and tribe in a very when I'm referring to tribe, I'm referring it in the most positive way as possible. So this is like my worldview was growing up. I mean, how would you, if you're looking back at yourself as a teenager, how would a human geographer now, an experienced one, would see a person's experience, be like, aha, like this is very interesting. Like, is that like how this young person is tracking how the world looks like? I don't know. Does this make sense?
I think one of the things you're pointing to here is the ways in which space is constructed, right? So space doesn't simply exist in the world in a very natural form. Human beings and societies construct space. And so when we move from one geographical location or one geographical context to another, the power structures change. The ways in which we're identified changes. The way in which we sometimes speak or act or think has to shift in order for us to better navigate those particular spaces. And the ways in which these particular spaces are controlled, are policed, often changes as well. And so I imagine when you move from one space to another, because of the kind of institutional power that's held within the school in comparison to your village or community, the kind of cultural power which is dominant in these two different spaces, means that the way in which you have to interact with these two different spaces is fundamentally different as well. And I think that that's something that we all have to contend with. Or most of us have to contend with if we have come from migrant communities, or we might have come from a lower income background and end up in a more middle class job. All of these types of things require us to navigate these different spaces in different ways.
So you mentioned that you experienced a bit of racism in university. I actually am very interested to know that. Was it, I mean, what kind of, yeah, I mean, please. It doesn't have to, you don't have to, like, I mean, if you're not comfortable to say exact thing, I mean, yeah, please go on.
So yeah, there were a few kind of campaigns that were run when I was, I guess, first or second year students, which were quite formative for me, where I guess elected officials and like high profile people on campuses said or did very racist things, and we ran campaigns to have them no longer in positions of power within the university. But probably one of the most well-known campaigns was a campaign that was carried out in support of two friends of ours who were arrested on campus in 2007, if I remember correctly. And so in our politics department, there was a former military officer called Dr. Rod Thornton, who was now a lecturer and he ran a course in terrorism studies, or a module in terrorism studies. Right? So he'd done counterterrorism work in Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. And a friend of ours, Rizwan Sabir, took his course. took his module. He was doing politics undergraduate. And on Dr. Rod Thornton's reading list was a Al Qaeda training manual, which had been declassified by the United States. So it was available on the United States website. You could buy it off Amazon. And so this formed part of the studies for this terrorism course. So our other friend Hisham had finished his degree at the university and was now working as an administrator at the university. And Rizwan asked Hisham to use his administrative privileges to print off some of his readings for his module. So he emailed over the readings. Hisham printed them off, gave them to Rizwan. That's the end of it. A few weeks later, someone was using Hisham's computer, another member of staff, and saw this desktop icon, Al Qaeda training manual, and called the police immediately. The police raided Hisham's office. They found that the email was sent from Rizwan. They raided Rizwan's home. They raided Hisham's home. They arrested them both, imprisoned them for about a week, charged them both with terrorism offences. And the university was very complicit in all of this and tried to help the police in this, despite the fact that Dr. Rod Thornton was very angry about this. And despite the fact that he isn't, a big anti-racist activist, he was very angry that his students are being arrested for carrying out the reading that he's asked them to do. And so there was a big campaign to exonerate these two, this student and this staff member, and challenge the criminalisation and the racism and the profiling that they were facing at the university. And I think that had a really profound impact as well on my understanding of racism as not simply being something that is carried out by individual bigots and people who are prejudiced, but something which is principally carried out by the state and agents of the states, in this case, the police.
This might be, skip if you think this is an unrelated question, but as an eagle-eye view, looking at humans, whatever you have read in your research, and before we all moved into civilization, let's say, what do you think? I mean, as you mentioned that, it's not just one person suddenly feeling like that they are above than the other because of how they look, but it is a much complex issue. Maybe it is it could be a state level, could be at like a continent level, could be married with different things. What is your idea on it? Like, what is kind of happening, however you have seen it or read it?
So I would say that institutions of power, from feudalism to the emergence of capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries, have always found it useful to classify groups of human beings in different ways in order to more effectively exploit and control, and if necessary, impose violence upon them. If we think about the example of Europe, for instance, this is something that was imposed upon Jewish people in Europe in the 15 or 1600s, upon Slavic people who migrated from Eastern Europe into parts of Western Europe in the feudal periods, in pre-capitalist Europe. It was something that was imposed upon Irish people in as early as the 15th and 16th hundreds. And this process of classifying different groups of people into different categories, effectively, in order to more effectively exploit them, or differently exploit them, differently control them, really accelerated with the emergence of capitalism and imperialism in the 16 and 1700s. And with European expansion to the Americas, across the African continent, across much of South Asia and parts of Southeast Asia, and of course Australia as well, and classifying these different the different peoples with which they came into contact, and therefore exploiting them differently. Some of them were of course enslaved, some of them were indentured, some of them were seemed to not be necessary at all and therefore exterminated, as was the case in Australia and much of the Americas. some of them became wage workers. Some of them became workers, right? Particularly the white working class of Europe. And so, with the expansion of capitalism in the 17 and 1800s, what you begin to see is the cementing and the fixing of these different, not the fixing, but the proliferation of these racial categories, which becomes more and more necessary for capitalism to differently exploit different categories of people across the planet. And today we call those people races, right? This is where we see the emergence of race become really fundamentally important. Simply, as I said, for capitalist exploitation, right? You are going to work as slave labor, you guys are going to be indentured labor, you guys are not necessary for us, so we're basically going to leave you to die or kill you. You guys are going to earn a wage, but not a very good one that you can only just about live on. Right? You know, being exploited in these different kinds of ways, which was useful in different ways for capitalism, but also the fact that they are controlled in different ways, and violence is imposed upon them in different ways, which relates, I guess, slightly to what we were talking about earlier, where some people might be controlled or policed because of some kind of anti-gangs policing initiative, and others might be controlled and policed because of some kind of anti-terror policing initiatives, and other people might be controlled and policed because of some kind of anti-immigrant policing initiative. We can see the ways in which these different categories of people, quote unquote races of people, are useful and become really necessary for these imperial or post-imperial nations to expand and maintain their power.
So is this relates to, I think, this concept of profiling, which which intelligence agencies do it. They have I think you might be able to explain profiling better to people than me, but do you think that concept, for the sake of efficiency, has deeply problematic issues? Or, I mean, please.
So I think that profiling is the outcome of the process of categorization that I just mentioned. Right? So first you have this process of categorization, categorizing different human beings in order to differently exploit, control, or impose violence upon them. And the outcome of that system of racial categorization is profiling, right? So on the kind of macro level, is where you see groups of people and populations being categorized differently. And then on the kind of micro level, that leads to prejudice. Right? On an individual level, that leads to prejudice and profiling. And so what we see on a kind of one-to-one basis might be a police officer profiling an individual, or an employer profiling somebody who comes to a job interview, or something of that nature. But that is the outcome of this wider system of categorization to exploit, control, and impose violence.
Brilliant. So we're coming back to UK. Have you seen any change or any kind of improvement or not in these all different kind of issues we are talking about? Interaction with different communities, migrant communities, BAM communities, the policing itself, and the structures which are now, in the past were governing or kind of participating in the world order, externally in foreign policy and also internally within UK. I mean, in last few decades, couple of decades, let's say, what are the changes? What has gone worse and what has gone better? Or if nothing, some things have remained exactly how they were.
Well, certainly nothing has remained exactly how it was. That's the only thing we can be certain of, I think.
Yeah.
I think that in many ways, the rise of the kind of white nationalism or resurgent nationalism that people might associate with Trump or Brexit, or maybe to a lesser extent Boris Johnson and others, in one way should be considered a threat and a problem and a defeat for anti-racism. But I think at the same time, what it also does, it indicates that that kind of overt nationalism is a kind of desperate attempt to maintain control. It's not the kind of comfortable slick, well-polished PR racism that we might associate with Tony Blair, uh, or that kind of approach to policing and governance and exploitation and imperialism, which can present itself as being progressive and multicultural and cosmopolitan, and has a broad consensus across multiple sections of society, but can still invade Iraq and kill a couple of million people and privatize public services and increase levels of inequality and deregulate the financial sector, which leads to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, which then leads to austerity and all of these other things. Whereas today, the nation is divided. On the one hand, you have the success of the Brexit movement, this movement of nationalism, of colonial nostalgia, and in many ways of certainly of anti-migrant sentiments, and I think in many ways different articulations of racism. But on the other hand, you have what we saw in the summer of this year, the largest anti-racist protests in British history, not only taking place in large multicultural cities like Bristol or Birmingham or Liverpool or London, but also in small towns and villages across the nation, which have never seen anti-racist mobilizations before and have people who have rarely, if ever, come into contact with people from racialized minorities. And I think one of the things that people in those smaller communities of England or Britain are saying is that they recognize the fact that they are the target constituency for the Brexit agenda, for this agenda of white nationalism. And I think by attending these anti-racist mobilizations, they're saying, no, we don't want to be the target constituency of this resurgent nationalism. We don't want to be the target constituency of this anti-migrant sentiment and this popular racism. We want a different vision of the country, and we want a different vision for the world. And I think in many ways, it's all to play for, and it's up to us as the agents of history to decide which direction this country and the world turns.
Beautiful. Just the last few things. This line, actively rethink and dismantle imperialism's afterlife by unlearning an unjust global hierarchies of knowledge production on which much of the empire's legacy was based. I find it really interesting, and I think we are talking about this right now, as in what kind of directions we should take, and what have you learned, and what do you think these lines mean to you, and what are the steps forward if we have to dismantle and untangle those tight ropes which somehow squeeze the prosperity out of people?
So I think that particular line is thinking about knowledge production. And I think it's interesting that a lot of the posters and placards and chants that we saw in the protests of the summer of 2020 were, if they weren't about Trump and Brexit or Boris Johnson, and they weren't about policing and immigration, they were about education. They were about the curriculum. They were about what we learn in our schools and what we learn in our universities. They were about what we consider to be useful knowledge, what we consider to be sophisticated knowledge, what we consider to be important knowledge production in places and spaces where proper or useful or influential or moral knowledge production takes place. And so I think one of the ways in which we can think about within the university how we can make sure that our work is a part of these global movements of resistance is thinking about the kind of knowledge that we produce and asking ourselves whether the knowledge that we produce reproduces dominance power structures, reproduces the assumptions of imperialism, that Europe and its settler colonies is where all useful knowledge is produced and has always been produced. We ask ourselves whether the work that we produce, the knowledge that we produce, identifies the ways in which imperialism has shaped the planet and shapes our perceptions of the world. And we should also ask ourselves about the political economy of our universities as well, the extent to which our universities might be implicated in investments in the arms trade or oil companies or the pharmaceutical industry or all of these other global circuits of international capitalism which continue to exploit the land and the earth, as well as its people, in ways that are wholly destructive, and not only threaten to continually reproduce colonial relations in ways that are not dissimilar to those experienced by previous generations, but also, of course, threats the existence of the planet that we live on itself.
Beautiful. I think we can end it here. I mean, yeah. Thanks a lot for doing it.
Cool.
Yeah.
No problem at all. Yeah, pleasure.
Yeah, it's brilliant.